When Russia and Iran signed their Strategic Partnership Treaty in January, it formalized a relationship that's been deepening for years. But with Iran now under sustained and unprecedented attack from Israel, eyes are on Vladimir Putin, and Russia's military capacity to help Tehran isn't what it used to be. If Tehran topples, Moscow will have lost another important ally in the Middle East, undeniably a blow.
Iran's supreme leader is making evacuation plans to go to Russia, and his regime is crumbling. Syria's former dictator, Bashar al-Assad, is already living in Moscow after his dictatorship collapsed. One thing is clear: Russia's once strong allies in the Middle East are getting humbled. And this is making Russia very afraid. Iran, in particular, used to be one of Russia's most important weapons suppliers in the Ukraine war. The Iranians also helped Russia to bypass oil sanctions. But most importantly, Iran and Syria were allies to help Russia in its fight with the West. Russia envisioned a grand alliance between all the pariah states, and hopefully including China, to collectively fight the US and NATO. Seeing how this has blown apart, Russia has a big problem. As we'll cover later, what happened in Iran and Syria could also happen in Russia itself. But first, let's go over how important Iran and Syria were for Russia. The Assad regime fell a while back in December of 2024, but we shouldn't underestimate how much of a blow this was for Russia. Bashar al-Assad was in power by the grace of Putin. In 2015, when Assad was about to be toppled by opposition forces backed by the US, Turkey, and others, Russia sent its own air force to help Assad with massive bombing campaigns. Putin even sent the infamous Wagner militia over to fight in Syria. Now, he did this for two reasons. First of all, he wanted to leverage Assad as a pawn to oppose the US in the Middle East. But he also saw Syria's strategic value for Russia. Putin has long been friends with the Assad family, and the Syrian government gave the Russians access to a vital port at the Mediterranean Sea called the Port of Tarsus. They also got an airbase nearby. It allowed Russia to project power in North Africa, Southern Europe, and the Middle East. Or at least it used to. Because in 2024, rebel forces made a sudden comeback. At around this time, the Assad regime was too weak, and it fell within days. The new Syrian government has ended the lease at the Tarsus port, and the Russian forces have begun a slow retreat. All their years in Syria suddenly ended with no result, and Turkey ultimately had the upper hand by backing the rebels. It was also a sign of weakness on the Russian side, because they seemed to abandon the fight against the rebels. Perhaps they were too distracted in Ukraine and had to focus all their resources on that conflict. Now, losing Syria was bad for Russia, but it wasn't the end of the world either. They're already talking to the new Syrian government. And even though Russia might not be able to keep its bases, Syria wasn't Russia's most vital partner. But Russia had no idea how much worse it could get. They didn't know that the same thing could happen to a much more important ally in the Middle East, namely Iran. After all, Iran's vast missile and drone arsenal should have protected it from a conflict with Israel. Also, Russia gave some of its best missile defense systems to Iran, namely the S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile systems. It was supposed to keep the Israeli fighter jets at bay, but that didn't work. Israel downed all of the Russian-made air defenses and achieved air superiority above the skies of Iran. This allowed Israel to cripple Iranian military and government targets. It's a threat to the very survival of the Iranian regime, and that's a big problem for Russia, because Iran is its most important ally, rivaled only by China. Before we go into the consequences of this for Russia, let's first go over how closely aligned these two nations were. The main reason for their partnership was that they both opposed the US. The Iranians really don't like Americans' involvement in the Middle East. They hated the interventions in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Libya, and they're scared that they might be next. But most importantly, they hate America's support for Israel. Over the years, America has given Israel $228 billion in military aid. Iran and Israel are bitter enemies, and the Islamic regime in Iran wants Israel to go away. Meanwhile, the Russians don't like America's involvement in Europe. Putin hated NATO's military expansion after the fall of the Soviet Union. Recently, he tried to stop it with the Ukraine invasion, but that's mostly failed. However, seeing how aligned they were, both Russia and Iran started to support each other in recent years. In the Syrian war we talked about earlier, Iran and Russia worked side by side to support Assad. both with the goal in mind to push back the West. Russia also helped Iran to establish its nuclear program, helping to construct the Bushehr nuclear power plant. This built up the Iranian nuclear program that later enriched uranium far above the levels needed for civilian purposes. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, cooperation expanded even further. Iran started to supply a massive amount of Shahed kamikaze drones to Russia to support its war in Ukraine. The estimates vary, but Iran has probably supplied several thousands of them. Iran has also helped Russia to build a factory to make Iranian-designed drones themselves. Now, Iran already started investing in drones way back in the 1980s, so they're more advanced than Russia in many ways. Russia uses these Iranian drones nearly every day in Ukraine, mostly to inflict damage on Ukraine's energy grid and its population centers. And of course, Iran has no problem with these war crimes, just like Putin has no problem with hosting Hamas leaders in Moscow. But the function of the Shahed drones goes far beyond spreading terror. Because the drones are so cheap, it allows Russia to drain Ukraine's air defenses. It's harder to shoot them down than to make them. In this way, the Iranian drones have become a crucial component of Russia's war of attrition strategy. And in this way, Russia really relies on the Iranians. But Russia also has things that Iran needs. It has way better legacy military equipment than Iran. Or at least, that's the perception. Because Iran thought it was covered after it bought Russian air defense systems like the S-300, the Tor M1, and recently the S-400. They all failed against Israel. Iran also tried to get fighter jets and attack helicopters from Russia. In 2023, there was reporting that Russia sold Sukhoi Su-35 fighter jets, Mil Mi-28 attack helicopters, and Yak-130 jet trainers to Iran. This was supposed to be a game changer, because the Su-35 is a very advanced fighter jet. And before, Iran relied on very outdated aircraft like the F-14 and the F-4. However, the new Russian fighters and attack helicopters have not been spotted in the recent fighting. With its F-35s, Israel now has full air superiority over Iran. So either Russia hasn't sent the Su-35s to Iran already, or they're just not operational yet. But the big deal, which is far more important than air defenses or fighter jets, has to do with military satellites. Military satellites allow a country to do precision strikes, and Iran is way behind in this regard, even though they have the missiles. Their imaging satellites have terrible resolution. Their launches into space were failing, and their satellites had unstable orbits. But Russia is helping Iran to catch up. It's launching satellites on Iran's behalf, and it's collaborating with Iran to give it the technical know-how of how to make satellites. Smaller things could be happening with missile technology. Iran is a big fan of missiles, but Russia is better at making them, especially when it comes to ballistic and hypersonic missiles. Russia could be sharing these technologies with Iran without anyone really knowing it. Now, a really wild theory is that this could also be true for nuclear weapons, a field where Russia is definitely an expert. Whether Russia would actually help Iran with this is pure speculation, and it would be a pretty desperate move. Nuclear weapons or not, Russia and Iran are definitely moving closer. In January of this year, the Russian and Iranian president signed a comprehensive strategic partnership in Moscow. One of the goals was to improve economic ties and bilateral trade. Iran and Russia are the two most sanctioned countries on Earth, so the fellow pariah states try to help each other out, so to speak. Russia also wants to use Iran as a strategic north-south transport corridor, allowing Russia to reach the Indian market. Iran and Russia also want to cooperate more with finance because they're both cut off from the SWIFT global banking system. On top of that, there were plans to expand joint military drills, to have greater coordination of oil and gas, and to collaborate on cybersecurity and cyber warfare. Because the full document is not known to the public, there could be many more things on there. But the tragic thing is that the comprehensive strategic partnership was only ratified by Iran on the 11th of June. 2 days later, a massive Israel attack happened. Chances are that the conflict continues, and if that's the case, the partnership won't be implemented. The Israeli attack also exposed a major flaw in the alliance between Russia and Iran, because Russia didn't really care to intervene. Russia did condemn Israel for this violation of international law, which is ironic coming from the Kremlin, but apart from the statement, Russia has promised no arms support for the Iranian regime, and it didn't send any additional equipment over to Iran. The supreme leader would appreciate some extra air defense systems if they don't get shot down immediately, at least. This lack of Russian support reflects two things. First of all, Russia doesn't have any spare resources to commit to Iran because it's struggling with Ukraine. It can't afford to get involved in two wars at the same time. This was already clear as day when it saw what was happening in Syria in December of 2024. The lack of Russian support was the main reason for the fall of the regime there. But secondly, it also shows that relations with Iran were never about true friendship. And to understand this, we need to look at a bit of history. The two countries have had diplomatic relations for more than 500 years. and for a long time, the two were friendly to each other. But starting with the First Russo-Persian War in 1651, the two nations started to fight each other. This continued all the way to the Fifth Russo-Persian War starting in 1826. Because the Russian Empire was very strong at the time, northern Iran got under Russian influence. And in 1907, the Russian Empire teamed up with the British Empire to divide Iran into three spheres of influence: the Russian zone in the north, a neutral zone in the middle, and the British zone in the southeast. This was humiliating for the Iranians. And later, after the Russians withdrew briefly during the Russian Revolution, the Soviets returned in 1920 and occupied parts of northern Iran. They only withdrew in 1946 after the Second World War was over. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 took over Iran with a coup d'etat to get oil resources. And this made Iran an enemy of the Soviet Union by associating with the West. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which put a new Islamic regime in power in Iran, things didn't get much better. A year later, the brutal Iraq-Iran war started when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. The Soviet Union was initially neutral, meaning that it provided arms to both sides. But in 1982, they started to fully support Iraq. They didn't like the new Islamist regime in Iran, and they also had the historical rivalry with Iran in mind. So, knowing this bit of history, it's obvious why Russia and Iran aren't the best of friends. But 3 years after the Iraq-Iran war ended, the Soviet Union fell, and this reset the playing field. But to this day, Iran and Russia are not true allies. Both countries want to be extremely powerful, but they just so happen to be in the same camp when it comes to opposing the West. Beyond that, there's not really a lot of agreement. In 2007, Iran was offered to join the CSTO, a Russian organization that is basically a copy of NATO. Initially, Iran seemed interested, but it never followed through with it. Probably because it doesn't trust Russia for historical and strategic reasons. And ideologically speaking, the two don't align at all, because the Iranian regime is strongly Islamist. The only thing the two nations share is their authoritarian government. So recently, when Iran was attacked by Israel, Russia simply backed out. Ultimately, Russia only wanted to leverage the Iranian regime. It had no interest in actually protecting it. Now, Putin is trying his best to mediate the situation because he prefers the Iranian regime still standing. In a phone call with President Trump, he said that Russia could broker an Israel-Iran deal. He even offered to take Iran's uranium into Russia. But this is yet another attempt by Russia to get more influence in the region. All of a sudden, Putin is trying to shift from a supporter of the Iranian regime to a peacemaker. He wants Russia to become a guarantor of regional security. But Trump, he's having none of it. So it's likely that Putin gets sidelined in the Middle East. And the ripple effects could be huge. Russia is trying to be a great power with influence all over the world, but being expelled from the Middle East would degrade the country to a regional power at best. Losing the Iranian oil smuggling and the trade through Iran would further hurt Russia's economy. And without Iranian drones, Putin would be considerably weaker in the Ukraine war. Also, if the Iranian regime does fall, it means that the West can shift resources from the Middle East back to Europe, which will only strengthen Ukraine. Speaking about the Ukraine war, the difference between how Israel is doing in Iran and how Russia is doing in Ukraine speaks volumes. Basically, it shows how the US-backed alliance performs against the alliance of pariah states. Russia has been fighting Ukraine for several years with very minimal progress, but in several days, Israel has crippled many parts of the Iranian military. Russia is losing a ton of aircraft in Ukraine, but Israel can operate freely in Iran's skies to bomb targets without losing a single fighter jet as of now. Russia can't target Zelensky and his military commanders, but Israel has been able to eliminate the top of the IRGC. And the list of comparisons like these goes on and on. It certainly seems to suggest that the Western militaries are superior, with better weapons, better technology, and better intelligence agencies. Because what Ukraine and Israel have in common is that they're fighting with Western funding and Western arms, and are being informed by Western intelligence services. The United States in particular is their biggest backer by far, not to minimize their own contributions, of course. Now, if we look at these two conflicts in Iran and in Ukraine, it raises some interesting questions. Because if Iran is so weak, what about Russia? There are a lot of similarities between the two. Both countries reached way beyond their capabilities. Iran tried to take on the Middle East with its axis of resistance, but it's now crippled. By picking a fight with Israel, it seems like the Iranian regime signed up for its own demise. The same goes for Russia, which wanted a sphere of influence way beyond its national borders. But it made a big miscalculation in Ukraine, because it didn't expect to be fighting a proxy war with NATO. To be fair, there's a major difference between Russia and Iran. Russia has the biggest arsenal of nukes in the world, closely followed by America. Meanwhile, Iran has no nukes. In a way, these nukes serve to protect the regime from foreign countries, because no one wants to try out whether Russia's nuclear threats are legitimate or not. That's precisely why Iran was also pushing for nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons won't protect a regime from its own population, and with less and less allies, Russia is left to solve its war and its economic problems on its own. The pressure will only increase over time, which means that the regime in Russia could also collapse. So, the fall of Iran and Syria isn't just a blow to Russia's foreign policy. It's a mirror that shows what might lie ahead if Moscow continues down this path.